Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we're doing another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck 206 and it's titled Goyf is Good, actually. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is going to be Tarmogoyf, the old modern staple that has unfortunately fallen off just a little bit. It is 1 and a green for a star and 1+ star for a Lurgoyf. Its power is equal to the number of card types among cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1. So if you've never played with Tarmogoyf before, it's a little bit of a unique card. Essentially, it allows us to, if there's no cards in any graveyards, play a 2-mana 0/1, which is obviously not great. But if there are, say, 8 different card types among all graveyards, this then becomes a 2-mana 8/9. And that is incredibly powerful in the right deck. So obviously, we have to try to find the right deck for Tarmogoyf. And luckily, there is a commander printed specifically for Tarmogoyf in Disa the Restless. And Disa is 2 black, red, green for a 5/6 human scout. Whenever a Lurgoyf permanent card is put into your graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, put it onto the battlefield. Then, whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, create a Tarmogoyf token. Obviously, if we are playing around an entire deck with Tarmogoyf, we may as well also play the commander that makes Tarmogoyf tokens, essentially allowing us to kind of double up on our random card of the week. Now, with that being said, it also cares about the graveyard, it cares about technically milling or things going to the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, it cares about other Lurgoyfs, so we have a lot going on in this deck. And so what we're going to do is take a look at some of our themes and kind of break down how this deck works. So first up, we have, of course, Lurgoyfs. And to represent that, we have Altar of the Goyf, which is 5 mana for a kindred artifact Lurgoyf. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +X until the end of turn, where X is the number of card types among cards in all graveyards, and it gives Lurgoyf creatures you control trample. So this is one of those cards that is not a creature, even though it is technically a Lurgoyf. But if we are loaded up on these Lurgoyf effects, we can then kind of mill over the rest of our deck, put a bunch of creatures into play thanks to Disa, and also have a lot of these giant creatures. Because keeping in mind, we are loaded up on ways to make sure we can mill over as many cards as possible for us to hit 5, 6, 7 different card types in our graveyard, making our Tarmogoyfs massive, making our other Lurgoyfs probably pretty massive. And one of the best ways that we can actually do that is with our second theme, which is going to be self-mill. So not only are we loaded up on these cards, we're actually loaded up on ways to put those cards directly into our graveyard. And a nice interaction is with something like Grisly Salvage, which is a black and a green for an instant. Reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a creature or land card from among them into your hand, then put the rest into your graveyard. So while this doesn't look that powerful, it just digs a little bit deeper, helps us find something. With Disa in play, if we hit even just, say, 2 Lurgoyfs in the top 5 cards, we can put them directly into our graveyard, and then Disa will put them directly into play. So Grisly Salvage is a great way to fill up our graveyard, a great way to make sure that we're hitting our lands or our creatures, whatever we may need. And then also it's a great way to really just outvalue the table as long as we have Disa in play. So it pairs really well with our Goyfs, and it pairs really well with our commander. But of course, we then move to our final theme of the deck, which is what cares about card types, and that is Delirium. So Delirium is an ability that triggers when we have 4 or more different card types in our graveyard, and that is something that we have specifically built our deck around. So for example, we have instants, sorceries, we have kindred, like with Altar of the Goyf, we have artifact, also like with Altar of the Goyf, enchantments, creatures, planeswalkers, we even have some battles, lands, so we have plenty of ways to get pretty much everything we want into the graveyard and get Delirium as quickly as possible. What then becomes our payoff for Delirium, you may be wondering? That comes with cards like Winter Misanthropic Guide, because Winter is 1 black, red, green for a 3/4 legendary creature human warlock. He's got Ward 2, and at the beginning of your upkeep, each player draws 2 cards, but if we have Delirium, as long as there are 4 or more card type among cards in your graveyard, each opponent's maximum hand size is equal to 7 minus the number of those card types. So if we just have 4 different types in the graveyard, each of our opponent's maximum hand size is now 3, but it's very simple for us to actually get up to 7, meaning our opponents have a maximum hand size of 0, and essentially have to discard their entire hand at the end of every single one of their turns. While that's obviously going to put a bit of a target on our head, it is also a very powerful way to play the game, because we are getting creatures for free, and our opponents would essentially have to use what they draw for their turn, or lose it forever, putting us in a position where we can kind of outvalue and out-aggro the rest of the table, while also powering up our Lurgoyfs at the same time by forcing all of our opponents to discard. Now, those are all of our themes for this week, and the next thing we're going to have to do is talk about some key cards. And these are cards that synergize really well with what the deck is trying to do, and in some cases are win conditions or value pieces all on their own. So the very first key card that I want to highlight is going to be Hedge Shredder. And Hedge Shredder, 2 green for a 5/5 artifact vehicle. Whenever it attacks, you may mill 2 cards. Whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then it has crew for 1. Notably, we mill ourselves a lot in this deck, and if we have Hedge Shredder in play, any lands that we mill go straight into play. And yes, they come in tapped, so we can't use them right away, but it still helps us ramp more than pretty much any other ramp spell in the entire deck. And if we can play it right, this means that we are putting lands into play, we're also putting our Lurgoyfs into play, so almost everything we are going to be milling is actually just going to be coming into play for free, and that is a huge value piece, and something that if we are allowed to keep for 1, maybe 2 turns, we can kind of just run away with the game. So I do think Hedge Shredder is very underrated overall, and in this deck is probably the MVP of the entire deck. Moving on though to our second key card, this one is going to be Tarmogoyf, one of the better Goyfs that came out of the Modern Horizon 3 Commander decks. It is 3 and a red for a star/1+star Lurgoyf. Its power is equal to the number of card types among cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. So the exact same power and toughness as Tarmogoyf, but for double the mana. And double the mana is because it has a second ability that says whenever it or another Lurgoyf creature enters the battlefield under your control, that creature deals damage equal to its power to any target. This is probably the most efficient non-combat way we have to win the game in this deck, because if we can hit each opponent for just 1 damage and we have Disa in play, that's going to trigger her 3 times. We make 3 Tarmogoyf tokens, and say we have 8 different card types among cards in all graveyards, so we have 3 different 8-power creatures come in. That means we can do 8 damage 3 times to any different targets on the battlefield. So we could just immediately say this person is taking 24 damage. Maybe we knock a player out of the game. We can kill blockers. We can kill commanders. We can do a ton of damage. It is one of the most efficient ways to just dish out damage at almost an uncontrollable rate for our opponents. Because if we can make our Tarmogoyf tokens, if we can hit Lurgoyfs with Disa and put them into play, we can essentially just burn out the table and also kind of control what's happening on the board. If maybe they're not super big, we're only hitting for 2 or 3, we can still take out creatures and commanders and blockers. So I think Tarmogoyf really does deserve a spot as a key card, because it is an incredibly powerful card once you get your engines rolling. And then though, finally, we come to our last key card, which is going to be Fecund Greenshell. And Fecund Greenshell, 3 green for an elemental turtle. It's got reach, it's a 4/6, and as long as you control 10 or more lands, creatures you control get +2/+2, but most importantly, whenever it or another creature you control with toughness greater than its power enters, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped, otherwise put it into your hand. And while we're not built around creatures with toughness greater than their power, Tarmogoyfs and most Lurgoyfs in general just naturally have that stapled onto them because their power and toughness is typically a star and then 1+ star for their toughness, meaning every Tarmogoyf and most Lurgoyfs are going to trigger the green shell. And if every single creature that we have, or at least most creatures that we have, are triggering the green shell, that means that we are most likely ramping if we're hitting land cards, or at the very worst, drawing a card, which is still very powerful as the game goes on. Plus, once we hit 10 or more lands, our creatures are getting +2/+2, meaning they do more damage with Pyrogoyf, they can squeeze through more damage if we have Trample. It really just does do everything we want it to do, which is not what I expected from an Elemental Turtle in a, Lurgoyf deck, but somehow the Feckin' Green Shell does manage to be an absolutely amazing card for this deck, and definitely deserves a spot as one of the MVPs. But I think that brings us to the end of our key cards for this week, and the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some cool interactions. And these are cards that synergize really well together, and in some cases are either combos or just fun interactions that I want to highlight. So the first pair of cards I want to talk about is going to be Fear of Missing Out and Grim Flayer. So Fear of Missing Out, again, one of the better payoffs we have for Delirium. It is 1 in a red for a 2/3 enchantment creature nightmare. Also notably, being an enchantment creature means it doubles up for Delirium. When it enters, you discard a card, then draw a card, and it has Delirium. Whenever Fear of Missing Out attacks for the first time each turn, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, untap target creature. After this phase, there is an additional combat phase. That's going to pair really well with Grim Flayer, which is a black and a green for a 2/2 human warrior, has Trample, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, Surveil 3, but if you have Delirium, it gets +2/+2 as long as you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. So while these two aren't particularly notable combined, they actually work really well when you consider that they both need Delirium, they both need to attack, and ideally at least one of them needs to do combat damage. Because what we can essentially do is use Grim Flayer to fill up our graveyard to hit Delirium. We can use Fear of Missing Out to also fill up our graveyard and hit Delirium. And then we can start attacking with the Grim Flayer. If we have Delirium, it's a 4/4 with Trample, meaning it is most likely going to get through for combat damage, letting us Surveil 3. Then we can also untap it, get an additional combat phase, hit someone again with the Grim Flayer, Surveil 3 again, and this puts us in a situation where if we have Disa in play, we've now made 2 Tarmogoyf tokens because we've hit a player twice, and we've surveilled a grand total of 6 cards. So there is a chance that we just put a ton of Lurgoyfs into the graveyard, get them all back, and now next turn we can attack for even more power, maybe trigger something else with Delirium, and it just kind of snowballs out of control a lot faster than you might expect, especially because they're both 2-drops. Being able to drop Grim Flayer turn 2, Fear of Missing Out turn 3, and probably at that point you might have already hit Delirium. It's not unlikely for us to get Delirium on turn 2, 3, maybe even sooner. I don't know if there's a way to do it turn 1, but I like to think that there is somehow. If there is, let me know. Maybe I missed it. But overall, this is just a great way to fuel the graveyard, a great way to get in combat damage, and a great way to kind of manipulate our next couple of draw steps. Moving on, though, to a cool interaction that is going to be very different than just pure value, and this is one of the closest ways we can get to an infinite combo in this deck. We have the Gitrog monster and Underrealm Lich. So the Gitrog monster, 3 black-green for a 6/6 legendary creature frog horror. It has Death Touch. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice the Gitrog monster unless you sacrifice a land. You may play an additional land on each of your turns, and whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. The key wording on Gitrog here is that the lands have to go into the graveyard from anywhere. That does mean that we can mill them with a lot of our mill effects. And why that's going to be relevant is because we can partner it up with Underrealm Lich, which is 3 black-green for a 4/3 creature, zombie, elf, shaman. If you would draw a card, instead look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put 1 into your hand and the rest into your graveyard, and you can pay for a life, give Underrealm Lich indestructible until end of turn, and tap it. So why is that going to be relevant? Well, essentially what we're going to do is at the start of our turn, we trigger Underrealm Lich. So instead of drawing our card for turn, we instead look at the top 3. We put 1 into our hand and the other 2 into the graveyard. If any of those cards that go to the graveyard are lands, we then trigger the Gitrog monster again because it sees a land go into the graveyard, so we draw a card, triggering Underrealm Lich again, and as long as we can keep putting lands into the graveyard with the Lich, we can actually just draw our entire deck, put all of our lands into the graveyard, and put ourselves in a position where we can pretty much win almost immediately, especially if you consider maybe we have Disa and we're putting all of our Lurgoyfs into play, we have Pyrogoyf doing damage, we have some other cards in the deck that also do damage when things enter or leave the graveyard. So while this could technically wind up having us decking ourselves, you also have to keep in mind we're not drawing cards. Underrealm Lich prevents us from drawing cards, so even if we do manage to churn through our entire deck, we're not going to die to drawing a card from an empty library as long as we control Underrealm Lich. Obviously, if someone has an answer to Underrealm Lich, then we get a little bit messed up, but I imagine if they had an answer, they probably would use it before we drew our entire decks. So something to be aware of. If this isn't your playstyle, then obviously you may want to take one of these cards out because neither of them are maze. They are mandatory. You would have to activate this if it happened. So that is something to be aware of. So anyway, that brings us to the end of our cool interactions, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, the price of the deck came out at $88.09, so pretty close to our budget limit, but not the most expensive it could be. And the most expensive card in our deck is once again a modern staple in Nethergoyf. Nethergoyf, kind of the replacement for Tarmogoyf, unfortunately for poor Tarmogoyf. It is 1 black for a Lurgoyf. Once again, power is a star, toughness 1+ star. Nethergoyf's power is equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. Then it has escape for 2 and a black. You can exile any number of other cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types from among them, and then you can cast it from your graveyard. So while Nethergoyf is a phenomenal modern card, in our deck it's just kind of okay because we don't really want to be escaping it. We don't want to exile our Delirium cards from our graveyard. And it only counts our graveyard, not our opponent's graveyard, so it's not as powerful as it could be. However, with that being said, it is still a Lurgoyf, and any Lurgoyf in this deck is a good Lurgoyf, so that is something to be aware of if you're putting the deck together. However, if you do need to trim it for budget purposes, you certainly can bring it down to about $74, which is much more manageable than $88. But if you're looking for something on the other end of the spectrum, say something a little bit outside of our price range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And this week, our out-of-budget upgrade that I would recommend is actually Overlord of the Baelmerk. Unfortunately, I did not realize when I was putting this deck together that Overlord of the Baelmerk was a massive $22.90, because I did have it in the deck up until I had to start cutting things for budget reasons, because I didn't realize that even though it was seeing play in Standard and in Pioneer, that it had commanded such a massive price. However, I do think it is worth that price if it's something you want to include in the deck, because it is 3 black for a 5/5 enchantment creature avatar horror. It has impending 5 for 1 in the black, so you can cast it as an enchantment. It'll enter with 5 time counters, and then in your end step you remove a counter. Once the last one's removed, it becomes a creature. And whenever it enters or attacks, you mill 4 cards. Then you may return a non-avatar creature card or a planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand. This is, once again, a great way to start filling our graveyard as early as turn 2, and it gives us a 5/5 attacker that in the late game can attack and continue to mill our graveyard. And worst case scenario, it's an enchantment creature, so it counts for 2 of our different Delirium targets. So I do think Overlord is definitely worth the inclusion. It is, like I mentioned though, incredibly expensive. If you are looking to include it into the deck, you would of course have to cut a card out of the deck, and the card that I would recommend taking out is Unshakable Tail, which is 2 and a black for a 3/2 zombie detective. When it enters the battlefield and at the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1. Whenever one or more creature cards are put into your graveyard from your library, investigate. Then you can pay 2 and sacrifice a clue to return the Unshakable Tail from your graveyard to your hand. Overall, this is not a bad card, but it's definitely one of those cards that's a little bit more grindier than what we are looking for. We really want to have these explosive turns where we put a ton of Lurgoyfs into play, we hit people for a ton of trample damage with all of our creatures, maybe we burn some people with Pyrogoyf, and Unshakable Tail really needs multiple turns to be able to do the thing that it's trying to do, because even when we mill over a bunch of creatures all at once, we still only get 1 clue token from it, and we typically would want to save that clue to bring back the Unshakable Tail. So it's not really what we're trying to do in the deck. It's a little too slow, it's a little bit clunky. And again, that's not to say it's a bad card, it's just for what our game plan is, it doesn't quite fit the theme. So that brings us, though, to the end of our deck tech for today. And before we get into a game with this deck, because of course we got to see how this deck performs, I do want to take a second to shout out some of our patrons and channel members. Also, let everybody know that if you would like to join us over on Patreon, you can. Patreon.com/DungeonLearnersGuide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. If neither of those are appealing to you at the moment, I completely understand. May just not be the time. You can always just like the video, subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit as well. And last but not least, you can also head on over to Shipping Shield, where we have some codes for you to get some discounts on some amazing products. And anything you purchase, we get a little bit of a kickback from. So that is another way to support the channel if you're interested in doing so. So, before we move on to the game, I do want to shout out our current patrons and channel members. So a huge thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Keegan Tawney, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, and the Oak Monster. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support, and if you would like your name listed with those amazing people, like I said, please do check us out on Patreon or right here on YouTube as a channel member. But with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our game for this week, talk about our opponents, and see how we're going to do. So as always, we are joined by 3 opponents this week. In this case, it is Doodle playing Alayla, Artful Provocateur, Bilal playing Black Panther Wakandan King, and Vintage playing Ayara First of Loch Thwain. So starting off with Doodle and his Alayla deck, this is actually a Flyers deck, so he wants to focus more on using the fairies that he gets from Alayla's ability rather than just artifacts and enchantments, and he wants to find ways to protect his Flyers and draw cards with his Flyers, and just kind of outvalue the rest of his opponents in the air, which I think is a super unique and cool take on Alayla, so I'm very excited to see what it can do. Next up, we have Bilal and his Black Panther deck. This is kind of like a landfall meets creature fall synergy. He really wants to just make a ton of creatures and a ton of tokens, while at the same time making his lands very relevant throughout the course of the game. And this is my first time playing against a Black Panther deck. I'm very excited to see what it can do. I think Black Panther is a super sweet character. I think the card really captured his, the idea of who he is as a person, his personality, his abilities, all of that. So I'm excited to see what it can do. And then last but not least, we have Vintage playing Ayara. And we've seen Ayara a couple of times on the channel already. It's kind of a mono-black value deck that also cares a lot about sacrificing its own creatures and making tokens and just kind of draining out the rest of the table while kind of maintaining that typical mono-black game plan of play creatures, drain the table, sacrifice creatures, drain the table more, and just keeping that ball rolling. I think that if I had to pick a deck to be the most concerning for us, it's probably going to be Alayla. We don't have a great way to deal with Flyers, and a lot of Lurgoyfs, while very powerful, don't actually have trample. So having to run into a little 1/1 fairy, or worse, Alayla, because she herself has Death Touch, means that we may not be able to push through Doodle's board very effectively. I think that's something to be concerned about as we go in. But Enough about my own opinions on this. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions as well. So down in the comments, please do let me know who you think is going to walk out the winner. Make sure you get those predictions in. But other than that, I hope you all enjoy the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by myself, Bilal, and then Vintage. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a Plains. I play a Desert of the Fervent. Bilal plays a Forest and casts the Ozolith, so whenever a creature he controls dies, he puts all counters that it had onto the Ozolith, and then can move them to another creature at the beginning of combat on his turn. Vintage plays a Swamp. Doodle plays a Swamp and then casts Throne of the God Pharaoh, making each opponent lose life in his end step equal to the number of tapped creatures he controls. I play a Temple of Malady, scrying 1. Bilal plays a Plains and casts Gala Greeters, letting him either create a tapped treasure, gain 2 life, or put a +1/+1 counter on it whenever another creature enters under his control, but only once for each option each turn. Vintage plays a Swamp and casts Lampad of Death's Vigil, letting him sacrifice a creature to gain a life and make each opponent lose a life. Doodle plays a Plains and casts a Skyclave Relic. I play a Forest. Bilal plays a Plains and casts a Soul Ring, then casts his commander Black Panther Wakandan King, putting a +1/+1 counter on a land he controls whenever Black Panther or another creature enters under his control, and letting him pay 3 to move all counters from a land he controls onto target creature, gaining life equal to the counters removed and drawing a card. This means he puts a counter on a Plains and a counter on Gala Greeters. Vintage plays a Myriad Landscape and casts Skursdog High Priest, which can tap to create a 4/4 demon token, but only if a creature died this turn. Then he attacks me for 1 with the Lampad. Doodle casts a Smothering Tithe, letting him make a treasure token whenever an opponent draws a card, unless that opponent pays 2 mana. Then at the end of turn, I cast Grisly Salvage, revealing the top 5 cards of my library, putting Underrealm Lich into my hand from among them, and putting the rest into my graveyard. Notably, this also gives me Delirium, as I hit a land, sorcery, artifact, creature, and planeswalker. Then when I draw for my turn, I pay for Doodle's Smothering Tithe, and play a Rakdos Carnarium, returning a forest to my hand. When Bilal draws for turn, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, letting Doodle make a treasure. Then he plays a Hushwood Verge and casts Rabble Rousing, hiding away a card, making a 1/1 citizen token for each creature he attacks with, and being able to cast the hidden card for free when he attacks and controls 10 or more creatures. This lets him attack Doodle and I both for 2 damage, making 2 citizen tokens, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on a Plains, putting a +1/+1 counter on Gala Greeters, and making a tapped treasure token. This means I take 2 from Black Panther and Doodle takes 3. When Vintage draws for his turn, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, then sacrifices his Myriad Landscape, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped, and then he attacks Doodle and I both for 1. Doodle plays a Dismal Backwater, gaining a life, and casts Meathook Massacre for X=3, giving all creatures -3/-3, wiping the board and letting Doodle gain 6 life since 6 of his opponent's creatures died, also making each opponent lose a life whenever one of his own creatures dies. Notably, Bilal also moves 2 counters onto the Ozolith. When I draw for my turn, I don't pay for Smothering Tithe, then I play a Forest and cast my commander Disa the Restless, letting me return any Lurgoyf permanent from my graveyard to the battlefield if it's put there from anywhere other than the battlefield, and also letting me make a Tarmogoyf token whenever 1 or more creatures I control deal combat damage to a player. When Bilal draws for turn, he pays for Smothering Tithe, then recasts his commander Black Panther, putting another counter on his Plains. Then, when he moves to combat, he moves the 2 counters from the Ozolith onto Black Panther. In his second main phase, he plays a Garden of Freyalise, then passes. When Vintage draws for his turn, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, and then casts Phyrexian Obliterator. making any player that deals damage to it sacrifice that many permanents. Then he plays a Lotus Field, sacrificing 2 lands when it enters. Doodle cast a Jubilant Skybonder, making spells that target his flying creatures cost 2 more to cast. Then he cast Darksteel Mutation, enchanting Black Panther, turning him into a 0/1 insect with indestructible and no other abilities. Once that resolves, he also cast Aura of Silence, making artifact and enchantment spells his opponents cast cost 2 more, and it can also be sacrificed to destroy an artifact or enchantment. When I draw for my turn, I don't pay for Smothering Tithe, then I attack Doodle for 6 with Disa, creating a Tarmogoyf token that is currently a 7/8. Then in my second main phase, I play a mountain and cast Underrealm Lich, which replaces my draws with the ability to look at the top 3 cards of my library, put 1 into my hand and the other 2 into my graveyard. Finally, I cast Nether Goyf, which is currently a 5/6. When Bilal draws for turn, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, then cast Font of Mythos, letting each player draw an additional 2 cards in their draw step. Then he attacks Doodle for 2 with Black Panther, creating a citizen token as well. When Vintage draws for his turn, he draws 3 cards and doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, letting Doodle make 3 treasures. Vintage then plays a Swamp and casts Dusk Mangler, discarding a card and forcing each opponent to sacrifice a creature, discard a card and lose 4 life, killing Jubilant Skybonder, Nether Goyf, and Black Panther. This also triggers Meathook Massacre, making each of Doodle's opponents lose a life while he gains 2. Doodle draws 3 cards for his turn, then plays an island and casts his commander Alayla Artful Provocateur, giving his flying creatures +1/+0 and letting him make a 1/1 fairy token whenever he casts an artifact or enchantment, which he immediately does, casting Ornithopter of Paradise and creating a fairy token. After that, he casts Reconnaissance Mission, making another fairy, and now letting him draw a card whenever a creature he controls deals combat damage to an opponent. On my turn, since Underrealm Lich now replaces my draws, I wind up putting 3 total cards into my hand and 6 into my graveyard, which notably include Mortivore, Detritivore, Necrogoyf, and Terragoyf, all of which go into play thanks to Disa. Once that resolves, I cast Cash Grab, milling 4 cards and putting a permanent card milled this way into my hand, getting Walk-In Closet/Forgotten Cellar. Notably, I also mill Pyrogoyf, putting it into play, and now doing damage to any target equal to the power of any Lurgoyf that enters under my control, this time doing 7 to Alayla, killing her. Once that's resolved, I cast the Walk-In Closet, letting me play lands from my graveyard, so I play a forest from my graveyard, and cast Sakura Tribe Elder before moving to combat, attacking Bilal for 12 with Disa and a Tarmogoyf token. He blocks the Goyf, killing his citizen token, but before damage he also casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Disa and letting me gain 6 life. When Bilal draws his 3 cards for his turn, he doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, but he does play a Canopy Vista and cast Vrestin Monoptera Leader for X=4, so it enters with 4 +1/+1 counters and creates 4 1/1 insect tokens with flying. Then whenever he attacks with 1 or more insects, he puts a +1/+1 counter on each of them. When Vintage draws his 3 cards for turn, he also doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, then he plays a Temple of the False God and casts Sheoldred the Apocalypse, now gaining 2 life whenever he draws a card, and making an opponent lose 2 life whenever they draw a card. After that resolves, he casts a Voldaren Bloodcaster, creating a blood token whenever a non-token creature he controls dies, and moves to combat, attacking Doodle for 5 with the Dusk Mangler, but Doodle blocks with a fairy, killing it and taking no damage. When Doodle draws his 3 cards for turn, he loses 6 life, then he plays a Prairie Stream and recasts his commander Alayla. After she resolves, he casts Favorable Winds, making another fairy token and now giving his flying creatures +1/+1. He also cast a Sphinx Summoner, searching his library for an artifact creature, specifically Steel Hellkite, putting it into his hand. Finally, he attacks Vintage for 5 with his flyers, but Vintage blocks the fairy token with the Bloodcaster, killing both creatures, letting him make a blood token, and then Vintage takes only 2 damage. This also does 1 damage to each of Doodle's opponents while Doodle gains a life, draws a card, and loses 2 life. In his second main phase, Doodle sacrifices Aura of Silence to destroy the Font of Mythos. Then, at the end of turn, I sacrifice my Sakura Tribe Elder to search my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Instead of drawing for my turn, I look at the top 3 cards of my library, put 1 into my hand and the rest into my graveyard, then recast my commander Disa and attack Bilal for 1 with Detritivore, and attack Doodle for 6 with Terravore. Doodle blocks with Alayla, killing both creatures, but he still takes 2 damage thanks to Trample, also gaining 3, and Bilal takes 1, meaning Doodle gains a life, each of his opponents lose a life, and I make 2 Tarmogoyf tokens, doing 8 damage to both Vintage and Doodle. Then, in my second main phase, I play a mountain from my graveyard, and also cast Golgari's Signet. When Bilal draws for his turn, he loses 2 life and doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe. He then attacks me with his entire board, putting a +1/+1 counter on all of them since they're all insects, hitting me for 15 total damage, and also making 5 citizen tokens. When Vintage draws for turn, he gains 2 life and doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, then plays a swamp and casts his commander Ayara First of Loch Thwain, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a black creature enters under his control. After that, he casts Sinister Monolith, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever he moves to combat, which he immediately does, triggering it. In his second main phase, Vintage casts Dreg Recycler, gaining a life and making each opponent lose a life. When Doodle draws for turn, he loses 2 life, plays a swamp, and then recasts his commander Alayla. After that, he moves to combat, attacking Vintage for 11 with all of his flyers, drawing 3 cards when they deal combat damage, and losing 6 more life. In his second main phase, Doodle casts Sayani, Eye of the Storm, letting him scry X when it attacks, where X is the number of attacking creatures with flying. Finally, at the end of turn, Doodle's opponents lose 4 life, since he controls 4 tapped creatures. On my turn, I replace my draw, putting a card into my hand and 2 cards into my graveyard, which does include Goyf, coming into play and doing 8 damage to Bilal, also gaining me 8 life since it has lifelink. After that, I play a swamp from my graveyard, then cast the Gitrog Monster, letting me play an additional land on each of my turns, sacrifice a land in my upkeep, and draw a card when 1 or more lands go to my graveyard from anywhere. I then play a mountain and cast Sir Conrad the Grim, doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature goes to the graveyard from anywhere. Finally, I activate Sir Conrad, making each player mill a card, putting 2 creatures into the graveyard, hitting 2 creatures, making each opponent lose 2 life, and more importantly, I mill over a land. This triggers Gitrog, drawing me a card, which is replaced by Underrealm Lich's ability. At this point, if I can keep milling over a land with each draw, I can continue to repeat this process, also doing a damage to each opponent for each creature milled and putting any Lurgoyfs into play. This ends with each of my opponents taking 7 more damage, Graveshifter coming into play, returning Nethergoyf from my graveyard to my hand, doing 2 damage to Vintage. Notably, this also puts Anger into my graveyard, now giving all my creatures haste. Once all of that is resolved, I attack Doodle for 3 with Tarmogoyfs, and attack Bilal with the rest of my board. Before blocks, Bilal casts Secure the Wastes for X = 7, creating 7 1/1 soldier tokens, letting him block all my creatures. Unfortunately for Bilal, this kills all of his blockers, meaning each opponent takes 7 damage from Sir Conrad, and I do 8 damage to Doodle, making a Tarmogoyf token, which enters, doing 8 damage to Vintage, knocking out all 3 of my opponents, and winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on in that game. We very much got out ahead very quickly. Once we got Disa on board and started to roll into some of our Goyfs, it was very difficult for our opponents to stop us. Because as weird as it is, even a board wipe at that point wouldn't have done as much as you might expect, because we have so many ways to recur our creatures, ways to keep filling the graveyard, ways to keep doing damage. And of course, we eventually wound up winning with Sir Conrad, Underrealm Lich, and the Gitrog monster, which, yes, admittedly feels a little bit cheesy, but it definitely put in the work, and it wasn't an infinite combo. As you may have noticed, we still did wind up whiffing at the very end, but it's still very powerful nonetheless. Overall, the deck felt incredibly strong. I've actually played about 2 or 3 different games with this deck, and every single time I played it, the deck just felt good. It felt very synergistic. It felt like all the cards really just meshed well together, and it kind of created a bunch of different value engines that were difficult to deal with. Moving around the table, though, we'll move on to Bilal next. His Black Panther deck struggled a little bit throughout the course of the game. He had some of the pieces he needed to really get going, but he couldn't keep Black Panther on the board. I think the rest of us kind of realized that it would be a threat if given the chance to build up into being a threat, and so we found ways to keep removing it, whether it was through attacking, sacrificing, blocking, even just straight up removal, that kind of stuff. So a little bit unfortunate. Hopefully we'll get to see the Black Panther deck again in the future. I'm sure Bilal has intentions to bring it back out. Continuing around the table, we get to Vintage and his Ayara deck. His Ayara deck is one of those decks that can consistently be one of the biggest role players in the game, which I think is super cool. He usually puts people on the back foot with the draining effects and the sacrificing effects. And in this game, it was actually Sheoldred that was really putting the pressure on the entire table, except for us. Luckily, we were able to get around it with Underrealm Lich, meaning we never actually triggered Sheoldred, and that put us in a position to kind of remain just ahead of the rest of the table, enough to slowly close out a win. And then last but not least, we have Doodle and his Alayla deck. His deck also struggled a little bit early on from lack of mana. I think that getting the Smothering Tithe really helped him out, but he also struggled from keeping his creatures in play. He was never really able to keep Alayla on board, whether it kept getting removed or he had to use it to block or something like that. But it still put him in a position that I think if he'd been able to really get rolling and kind of build up some of those Smothering Tithe triggers, he definitely could have wound up winning the game. And we were once again very fortunate that Underrealm Lich got around Smothering Tithe. We never drew a card, so therefore we never actually triggered Smothering Tithe, at least after the first couple of turns. So it was a very sweet deck and a very sweet game overall. Please do let me know down in the comments what you thought, see if there's anything that we could add to the deck, maybe cards I put in that you don't think deserve to be there. And as always, if you have suggestions for future decks and future cards that you would like to see me build around, please do let me know down in the comments. I do try my best to get to all of them. However, I can't promise to get to all of them unless you are a member of the Patreon or a channel member, so that is something to keep in mind. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.